Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Rousseau's Social Contract. Today we're looking at Book 3, chapters 8 and 10, again dealing with the questions of the form of government. So let's deal that all forms of government are not suited to all countries. Freedom, not being a fruit of every climate, is not accessible to all people. So, notice this very much Montesquieu, right? That freedom, not being a fruit of every climate, is not accessible to all people. Very climate determinist, right? The more one ponders this principle established by Montesquieu, the more one senses its truth, right? This is again 91, and this again. I should get my glasses on right here. And this is a big note. No, it's not a big note. It's Montesquieu Spirit of Laws, particularly book 17, how the laws of political servitude are related to climate, right? And for the classical statement of this view, see Aristotle's Politics, book 7, about the free versus, the war, Asia versus Europe, right? The, So therefore, the more it is contested, the more opportunities there is to establish it by new proofs. In all the governments of the world, the public person consumes yet produces nothing. So that's the public person consumes yet produces nothing. What then is the source of the sustenance it consumes? So in other words, the public person as the government, this idea of the citizens, this is be the officials and that people they consume but they don't produce. So what is the source that it consumes? The labor of its members. It is the exercise. It is the excess of private individuals that produce what is necessary for the public. So private individuals produce what is necessary for the public. It follows from this that the civil state can subsist only as long as the product of men's labor exceeds their needs. So the civil state, this is the idea, the civil state can only exist. And I think this is where Durkheim will get his division of labor, society as the foundation of the division of labor, right? That is that only through the product of man's labor and building the excess of it, excess of their needs, without an excess of needs, as long as that the civil state can exist only as the product of man's labor exceeds their needs. Thus, now, this supply is not the same in all countries of the world. In several, it is considerable, in others, very minimal, in others, nil, and in others, negative. This ratio depends on the fertility of the climate, the kind of labor required by the land, the nature of its products, the force of the inhabitants, the greater or lesser consumption they need, and on several other similar ratios which are composed. So these are ratios. In other words, the ratio depends on the what? A fertility of the climate, so how fertile it is. That's a ratio. Then another ratio is the kind of labor required by the land, the nature of its products, the force of its inhabitants, the greater or lesser consumption that the inhabitants need, and on several and similar ratios of which it is composed. Right, this idea. Besides, all governments are not of the same nature. They are more or less vocarious, voracious. Voracious. Okay, voracious means like consuming, like voracious means like I'm going to eat, I'm going to eat, I'm going to eat, I'm going to eat. I have to consume a lot, right? There are some are more or less voracious. Some governments are, and some consume. That there's the idea the public person consumes. So therefore, the voraciousness of this is the vast. Some are going to consume more than others, and the differences between them are based on the additional principle that the further public contributions travel from the source, the more burdensome. So that's another way. So not only is there the level of veracity, but distance, size. The longer the words that the further contributions travel from their source, the more burdensome they are, in a sense. This burden must not be measured by the amount of taxes, but by the distance they have to travel to return to the hands from which they came. So in other words, circularization. In other words, I take the tax, it goes all the way to the capital, and then the capital then spends it back over here, right? This long, the distance between this and this. When the circularization is prompt and well established, it does not matter whether the people pay little or a lot. So, in other words, public goods always means that people pay. So, it's always going to be that their private wealth are going to provide in their labor, the excess of their labor and their goods, their labor and their goods, um, are taxed, and it goes to the government. The distance, so not only the amount, but because what happens, the public money should go back to the public. So therefore, the distance. The danger here is that the money that these people get the money they pay, but they don't feel that the money is coming back to them quickly enough or promptly enough. So they feel like being used. Okay, they don't feel good. They feel distrust. They feel used. If the government, if it's very close, then yes, I'm taxed. Like this is why, like in Sweden and the Scandinavian states are very taxed very high. Like when people say, "Oh, what about the Scandinavians? Their social welfare programs." Well, it's not because they have wealth. Everyone pays, even the working class pays. Okay, it's not really a socialism. This is why the Bernie Sanders of the world misrepresent what the Scandinavian economy is. It's an equal economy. Everyone pays high taxes. Why? Because everyone pays a burden. Okay, everyone is being benefited by the programs. Therefore, everyone must contribute. And because government is close to them, when it was localized, that they will put up with it. Now, in a European context, if the government is centralized in a European Brussels, what's going to happen? The money will be collected from the countries to go to Brussels to give. In other words, then there, and this is why there's anger and resentment of policies and decisions by the EU affecting the Scandinavian countries. Right. This is why the breakdown of the consensus that has been driven in some Scandinavian countries because of this. So the circularization is prompt and well established. It does not matter whether people pay a lot or little. It is always rich, and finances are always in good condition. On the contrary, however little the people may give, when this amount does not come back, it is soon exhausted by always giving. The state is never rich, and the people are always destitute. Okay, listen. So therefore, if the government is not circulating the money back into the system, if it isn't being spent, if you're spending it, taxing it, and it's not coming back into the system, it's always taking, and nothing is returned. This is what leads to people, it bankrupts them, it destroys them, exhausts them, he says. The state is never rich, and the people is always destitute. It follows that the greater the distance between the people and the government, the more burdensome taxes become. So therefore, big states, burdensome distance ahead of the centralization of the authority from the far from this. In other words, this is why you need to have confederated systems. Local government, state government should do it, not federal government. Why? State and local service, even states are too big. What the state does everything, then the people are going to feel that it's mismanaged. The local government has to deal with this. But if the local government doesn't have the means to do it, depends upon the state. This leads to the breakdown of state entities, right? The more burdensome taxes become. Thus, the people is least burdened in a democracy. More so in an aristocracy. In a monarchy, it bears the greatest weight. So therefore, the taxes and things, in other words, again, because the monarch then is only suited to opulent nations. aristocracies to states of average wealth and size, and democracies to small and poor states. In fact, the more one thinks about it, the more this explains the difference between free states and monarchies. The former, everything is used for the common utility. In the latter, the public and private forces are reciprocal, and one is increased by weakening the other. In other words, this is increased by weakening. If this is to be increased, this weakens the other one. These are reciprocal. Finally, rather than governing subjects in order to make them happy, despotism makes them miserable in order to govern them. Right? They make them miserable to govern. Then there are then for each climate natural causes on the basis of which it is possible to assign the form of government towards which the force of the climate leads it, and even to say that the type of inhabitants it should have. Right? Unproductive and barren places where the product is worth less than the labor to produce it should remain uncultivated and deserted, or populated only by savages. Places where the labor of men produce only the bare necessities should be inhabited by barbarous peoples. Any polity or any state or anything political body would be impossible there. So any political body would be impossible there. So therefore, it doesn't produce enough. Places where the surplus of product over labor is moderate are suitable to free people. Again, this is that whole point. Moderate is important. This echoes the thing that Aristotle's in Book 4, Chapter 11 says about the mesos, right? About the danger of the rich and the poor. The rich and the poor are without. They have no resources, no means. The wealthy has too much, excess. The mesos has enough. And this is what he says, moderate. Moderate means. In other words, this is a very important point he's making here. That a place where surplus of products over labor is moderate are suited for free people. Those where abundant and fertile soils produce a great deal with little labor demand monarchical government, so that the luxury of the princes consumes the excess of the subject surplus, because it is better for this excess to be absorbed by the government than dissipated by private individuals. There are exceptions, I know, but these very exceptions prove the rule, and that they sooner or later produce revolution that brings things back to the order of nature. In other words, this is the nature of the climate. Nature of things produce certain words, and also, like he says here, this paragraph here is a very interesting paragraph. It shows that the natural realm of what happens here is very. This is very shocking in Rousseau. In this sense, this is where Rousseau kind of embraces. While accepting the Hobbesian ultimate logic, he engages in a very un-Hobbesian embracement of the ancient understanding. Okay, like Montesquieu, following Montesquieu, so that the climate will reduce. In other words, you can't fight against nature; nature will win. This is that whole thing. It will produce revolutions that bring things back to the order of nature. Let us always distinguish between general laws and the particular causes that can modify their effects. So let us always understand the general laws, general principles, general laws, and the particular causes that can lead that this law doesn't happen, or this, in other words, that the effect happens, that can modify their effect. In other words, these causes that can modify this general law. Even if the entire South was covered with republics and the entire North with despotic regimes, it would be no less true that the effects of climate makes despotism suited to hot countries, barbarism to cold countries, and a good polity to intermediate regions. I see further that while granting the principle, there might be dispute over the application. It might be objected that there are very fertile cold countries and very unproductive southern ones. But this is a difficulty only for those who do not examine all the relationships involved. It is necessary, as I've said, to consider those of labor, force, consumption, and etc. So therefore, let's say you have a cold land that's very productive. Well, in other words, the force involved, the force of labor, the labor involved, the consumption, and the coldness might lead to be less consumption. Again, so therefore, this again is repeated. This again repeats the theme that Montesquieu addresses in his chapter on climate. This is why it's a very interesting thing. Let us assume that let us assume that given two unequal pieces of land, one produces 5 and the other 10. If the inhabitants of the former consume 4 and those of the latter 9, the excess of the first product will be 1/5 and that of the second 1/10. Right? Since the ratio of these two people surpluses is therefore inverse to the proportion of products, the piece of land that produces only 5 will provide a surplus that is double that of the land that produces 10. Right? So again, think about this. This is the in other words, that the land, what it produces versus what it's consumed, and then therefore the land that produces only 5. In other words, at 5 and the other 10. If the inhabitant of the former 4 and that of that, so there's 1/5, 1/5, and one. What is it? The ratio is 9/10. So therefore, the ratio here is that on the 1-to-1 ratio, if you do it like this, 1/5. So therefore, it's 1/5, 1/5 versus 1/10. See the ratio difference of this, of the surplus, will induce, since the ratio of these two surplus is therefore inverse to the ratio of the products, the price piece of land that only produces 5 will provide a surplus that is double that of the land that produces 10. So it's proportional, even though the other produced more, but okay, because because the proportion of production is better in that case. But it is not a question of double product. And I do not think anyone dares to claim that the fertility of cold climates in general is even equal to that of hot climates. Nevertheless, let us not assume this equality. Let us, if you wish, equate England with Sicily and Poland with Egypt. Further south, we find Africa and the Indies. Farther north, we find nothing at all. To achieve this equality of product, what difference is there of cultivation? Okay, what difference is there of cultivation? In Sicily, merely scratching the earth is all that is necessary. In England, what effort it takes to work it. Now, when there must now when there must be more hands to yield to the same product, the surplus should necessary be less. Consider in addition that the same reasons numbers of men consume much less in hot countries. The climate requires sobriety for good reasons. Europeans who want to live there in the same style they do in their at home will die of dysentery and indigestion. We are, as Chardin, we are, says Chardin, carnivorous beasts, wolves by comparisons with Asians. Some attributes of Persian sobriety to the fact that their country is less cultivated. But I believe to the contrary, that their country is less abundant in foodstuffs because the inhabitants need less. If their frugality, he continues, were an effect of scarcity in the country, only the poor would eat little, whereas in general everyone does so, and more or less would be eaten in each province according to the fertility of the countryside, whereas the same sobriety is found everywhere in the kingdom. They praise themselves highly for the way of life, saying one needs only to look at their complexion to recognize how much better it is than that of the Christian. In fact, the complexion of the Persian is smooth, They have lovely, delicate, and polished skin, whereas the complexion of the subjects of Armenia, who live in the European manner, is coarse and blotchy, and their bodies are fat and heavy. This is 92. Yeah, this is Sea Spirit of Laws. Again, this is 92, sorry. Rousseau's citation is from Shin's Voyages of Persia, 4 volumes, Amsterdam. This remainder of the chapter relates economics to climate in ways that are strikingly different from modern economic theorists. In other words, compare Locke, Second Treatise, Chapter 5, and Montesquieu's Spirit of the Law, Book 8, Book 18, especially Part 4 and Book 20 and 22 against modern commerce. It goes against the commercial argument and the expansion of, and the idea that there's going to be mass, in other words, cultivation of land produces a surplus, right? That's a big difference in Locke. The closer one is to the equator, the less people live on, the less they live on, they eat less. They eat almost no meat, rice, maize, kunshuns. I forget what this means, but I have to check that word. Millet, and cassava. So, in other words, they do not eat meat, but rice, maize, consulate, millet, cassava are the usual foods. In the Indies, there are millions of men whose nourishment costs under 1 cent a day. In Europe itself, we see noticeable difference of appetite between the peoples of the North and the South. A Spanish would live for a week on the German dinner. In countries where men are more voracious, luxury as well turns towards the things that are eaten. In England, luxury is shown by tables laden with meats. In Italy, you are treated to sugar and flowers. Luxury in clothing also offers similar differences. In climates where the seasonal changes are abrupt and violent, clothes are better and simpler. In those that where dressings are merely for ornamentation, ostentation is more sought after than utility. The clothes themselves are a luxury there. Every day in Naples, you will see men walking along the Papasillo wearing gold embroidered jackets, but no stockings. The same is true of buildings. Everything is devoted to magnificence when damage from the weather is not a worry. Weather is not a worry. In Paris and London, people want to be lodged warmly and comfortably. In Madrid, there are superb drawing rooms, but not a window that closes, and people sleep in rat holes. Foods are far more substantial and succulent in hot countries. This is a third difference that cannot fail to influence the second. So this is that the more substantial and succulent in hot countries. This is the first principle up here. The closer to the equator is people live on less, right? This is the third difference that one cannot fail to know. Second, why are so many vegetables eaten in Italy? Because they are good, nourishing, and have excellent flavor there. In France, where they are grown only with water, they are not nourishing and scarcely count as meals. However, they take up no less land and require at least as much effort to cultivate. It is known from experience that the wheats of barley, in other respects inferior to French wheats, yield much more flour than those of France, in turn yields more than the wheats from the north. It can be inferred from this that a similar graduation in the same direction is gradually observed from the equator to the north pole. Now, isn't a clear disadvantage to those? Now, isn't it a clear disadvantage to have a lesser quantity of nourishment from equal amounts of produce? Right. This is this idea. In other words, you gotta that you have more. In other words, more succulent. Why? Because they're vegetables, but their vegetables taste better. If you go north, they're only water and they're not a secular nourishment. But they consume the same amount of land and effort that other things go. Same too with grain. He talks about the difference of the grain to the south versus the grain of the north, right? And that barley having a better outcome product, the wheats of barley has better out product. In other respects inferior to French wheats. So barley's experience is inferior to French wheats, who yield more flour, and those in France in turn yield more wheat than the northern ones, right? So northern wheat barley is better, and so you're north, you'd rather produce barley than northern wheat, but in the south you'd prefer wheat than the barley because it produces more, right? To these different considerations, I can add that another that is derived from them and strengthens them. It is that hot countries need fewer inhabitants than cold countries and could feed more of them. This produces a double surplus, always to the advantage of despotism. The larger the area occupied by a fixed number of inhabitants, the harder it becomes to revolt, because men cannot take concert action promptly or secretly. And it is always easier for the government to get wind of the plans and cut off the communication. So that's where the big giant populations, this produces a surplus, right? This idea of hot countries need few inhabitants, cold countries. Cold need more. This produces a double surplus, right? Always to the advantage of despotism. The larger the area occupied by a fixed number of inhabitants, right, makes it very difficult to revolt because men cannot, they can't concert each other because being so many, they try to cooperate. It will be noticeable and they will be able to cut off communication. But the closer together a numerous people is, the less the government can usurp them from their sovereignty. So if the people are close together, live together like this, they're numerous people that is together, not spread out. Therefore, this is maybe Rousseau's argument. People will be spread out, the land will be smaller, and they will be together, and therefore it'd be harder for them to usurp them. Leaders deliberate as safely in their rooms as the prince in his councils, and the crowd assembles as quickly in the public square as the troops in their quarters. The advantage of a tyrannical government in this regard is thus to act over long distances. So this idea of tyrannical government, you have when everything is small, no small distances, varies every act. Then the people can react. They're together. They're together. They're magistrates. They will know it. They'll see it quickly. They'll respond quickly, and therefore, in other words, it's going to be very difficult for a tyrannical entity to do something. The advantage of tyranny is distance, long distance. But by long distance, people are spread out. People like that don't have enough time to react. They don't know. They cannot effectively cooperate against it. With the help of the points of support it sets up, its forces increase with the distance of that of levers, right? The idea of lever. This does not contradict what I said in Book 2, Chapter 9, about the disadvantage of large states. For there it was a question of the authority of the government over its members. And here it is one of its force against the subjects. So therefore, in other words, the big states, the authority is weak. The government is so large a proportion, and therefore when it lacks in authority, it has to rely more on coercion. But being so big, it was much more effective. It gives it more levers by which it can exert power. Um, its scattered members serve as points of support for acting upon the people from a distance, but it has no support for acting directly on these members themselves. Thus, the length of the levers is one instance of the source of its weakness, and in the other of its strength. So, its authority, in other words, its length of the levers gives it the strength, but it lacks authority. Right? This is that whole point, and therefore people view it as kind of okay. its weakness in that sense. The people's force, on the contrary, acts only when concentrated. It evaporates and is lost as it spreads, like the effect of gunpowder scattered on the ground, which only ignites grain by grain. So the idea that people together, the explanation is boom, explosion. Otherwise, you spread gunpowder on the ground, so it's the concentration of the power that makes the people's power effective. But it's when the people are dispersed, their power is dispersed. And therefore they will be able to act by one, not together. The least populous countries are thus the best suited to tyranny. So this is why the least populous countries, lands that are very unpopular, they thus are the best suited to tyranny. Wild animals reign only in a desert. Right? This is that idea. So this is the double sense. If there's lots of people, lots of things, if it's just too big, the danger of big, and distant, the terms of distance, that's the problem. But the concentration of the people, that's the difference in that sense. So there's a difference between size and concentration. Chapter 9, on the signs of a good government. Chapter 9. Therefore, when a question is asked whether it is absolutely the best government, one poses a question that is insoluble because it is indeterminate. In other words, what is what is absolutely the best government? No, there's no one to answer because it's an unsolvable question because it's too many things will determine what is best. If you prefer, it has many correct answers as there are possible combinations in the absolute and relative situations of people. Right, this is 93. Compare Aristotle's Politics, Book 1, Book 2, Book 7, and 8. For on Aristotle's reasons, for Rousseau's reasons for transforming the ancient question of the best regime into the modern one of what is law, i.e., is there a rational principle of obedience? See the passage of the Confession cited in editorial note 4. Okay, I'll go editorial note 4. So this is like Rousseau depiction of the original project. Now, talks about his original project, right? About this is confession and what is thus. He says, he goes. He goes. I'll give you the last paragraph. I thought I saw that this question was closely tied to the following one: that if indeed it was different from it, what is the government which, by its nature, always stays the closest to the laws? From that, what is the law, and a series of questions of importance. I saw that this led me to truths useful to the happiness of the human race, but above all to that of my country. Right. This is Confession 8, on the Petite, Volume 1, pages 404-405. Rousseau goes on to say that although but this is about the book about Holland, about this. I'm not going to read the rest of them. No, this is note 4 on page 132 and 133 of this edition. So let's continue. So, in other words, it's relative. This idea, the best is always relative to the situations of the people, the land, and the people, right? But if one asked by what sign it is possible to know whether a given people is well or badly governed, this is something else. The question of and the question of fact could easily be resolved. So, how do we know? What is a sign that people are well or badly governed? However, it is usually not resolved because each wants to resolve it in its own ways. Subjects praises public tranquility, citizens the freedom of private individuals. So subjects, tranquility, citizens, freedom. So that the idea that citizen and subject. A subject is someone who's underneath some authority, has no control, it's part of the sovereign. and a citizen is a active agent of the sovereign, right? So subjects want tranquility, citizens the freedom of private individuals. One prefer one prefers the safety of possessions, the other that of persons. One claims that the best government is the most severe, the other maintains that it is the most mildest. So, so therefore, one is one praises tranquility, the other freedom of private individuals, one for the safety of possession, and the other that of the persons. One claims the best government is the most severe, and the other maintains it is the mildest. Now, is it the same ones? Does the public tranquility and the freedom, is that the difference between those who are, the private, and then the next one is the safety of their possessions is the private person, not the public, prefers the safety of possessions, and the other that of the persons. Okay, what is that? That is, it's flipped. In other words, these are not parallel in the same column. Again, like Machiavelli. Again, reminds me of Machiavelli's chapter on virtues, right? Where the virtues, these lists of virtues, don't follow the same column. That it's not virtues here on one column and the other column are the vices. Here, there's this. Okay, they switch sides, right? Public, private. City possessions, is that private or public? And the other are people. One claims the best government is the most severe, the other maintains morality. The one wants crimes punished, and the other wants them prevented. One thinks it's fine to be feared by the neighbors, the other prefers to be ignored by them. One is satisfied when money circulates, the other demands that the people have bread. Even if there were arrangements on these agreement on these questions and other similar points, would a solution be any nearer? Since moral qualities cannot be precisely measured, even if there were agreement about the signs, how could there be about the way to estimate it? So therefore, here's another problem. This is I think that even if we get the signs, we can have clear signs. But the problem about this is that even if there's agreement on these claims, right, these signs, um, and other similar points, would a solution be any nearer? And I said, what is the best one? Which is the best one in that sense? No. Since moral qualities cannot be precisely measured, even if they were agreement about the signs, how could there be about the way to estimate it? In other words, how you can estimate the signs in that sense. As for me, I'm always astounded that one very simple sign is overlooked, or or not agreed upon out of bad faith. So there was the idea that there's always going to be a sign that's important to do this, and it's usually not agreed to. It is overlooked or not agreed to out of bad faith. What is the end of the political association? That's the assumption. Astounded. What is the sign? What is the end of the political association? Is it is it is it the preservation and prosperity of its members? And what is the surest sign that they are preserved and prospering? Is it their number and their population? Therefore, don't seek therefore don't seek this much disputed sign elsewhere. All other things being equal, the government under which, without external aid, without naturalization, without colonies, the citizens populate and the most multiply the most is indefinitely the best. So the one who reproduces itself without what? It populates and multiplies. It doesn't what? It doesn't rely on external goods, external aid, without bringing in people in, naturalization, and without setting out colonies. One under which a people grows smaller and dwindles away are the worst. Calculators, It's now it is up to it is up to you now. Count, measure, compare. That's a bit funny thing, right? The same print. Now, this is the thing. The same principle should be used to judge the centuries that deserve preference in terms of prosperity of the human race. Those in which the letters and arts flourished have been overly admired without discovering the secret object of their cultivation and without considering its disastrous effect. Um, Again, this is that line in Latin. I'll give you the quote in 94. Tacitus Agricola, he goes, and this in their ignorance they call a civilization, when it was but a part of their servitude, right? Like Rousseau's preceding note, this one was added to the social contract in the press when it was impressed. Okay, the second edition, not in the so. Will we never notice in the maximum of books and vulgar interest uh, that prompts the authors to speak? No. Whatever they may say, when the population of a country decreases, despite its brilliance, it is not true that all goes well, and that 100 uh, and that 100 poets has 100,000 pounds of income is not enough to make his century the best of all. Less consideration must be given to the apparent calm and to the leader's tranquility than to the well being of the entire nation, and especially the most populous social classes. Hail ravages a few cantons, but it rarely creates famines. Riots and civil war greatly frighten leaders, but they are not the true misfortunes of people, who may even have periods of respite when men argue about will tyrannize who will tyrannize over them. It is it is their preeminent condition that gives rise to their true prosperities or calamities. So the conditions of people, groups, or classes is what gives their true prosperities and calamities. It is when everything remains crushed under the yoke that everything perishes, and it is then apparent. That's hard. It is then that leaders destroy them at their pleasure. This is quote 95. I have to wear glasses. All right, this is they make a solitude and call it peace. Tacitus Agricola, right? They make a solitude. I think it's desert. Um, um, a solitude that and call it peace. On this sentence and next sentence, see the passage of the memoirs of Cardinal de Retz, who was the co-judge of Paris. Right? When the rivalries of the great, when the rivalries of the great agitated the kingdom of France, and the coadjutor of Paris went to the Parliament carrying a dagger in his pocket, these things did not prevent the French people from living happily and in large numbers in honest and free ease. Long ago, Greece flourished in the midst of the cruelest wars. Blood flowed freely, and the whole country was covered with men. It seemed, says Machiavelli, that in the midst of murder, prescription, civil wars, our republic became more peaceful. Our citizens' virtue, their mores, their independence, did more to reinforce it than all the dissensions to weaken it. A little agitation gives vitality to souls, and it is not so much peace as freedom that makes the species truly prosper. So it's not necessary, in a sense, peace, but freedom that makes it prosper. This is 96. Rousseau paraphrases the introduction to Machiavelli's History of Florence, but compares Machiavelli's argument. Compare Machiavelli's argument in Book 3 and 3 with Discourse Livy 1:4. On this note, Rousseau's argument in this chapter considered a burden-ended jovial judgment. This very criterion of population overthrows Rousseau's entire thesis that civilization is decadent. For as long with For along with commercial growth and the following of the arts and sciences which alarmed him, populations in his time grow enormously. On this point, he has for him a passage from Tacitus, and against him all the statistics. It is true that now population is declining in most civilized countries, although sometimes even rapidly. But nevertheless, civilized people have larger populations than barbarian. This is Jovial. This is Jovial's kind of comment on this. So let's go back here. Look at chapter 10 next. And this is the end of today's thing. On the abuse of government and the tendency to degenerate. Just as the private will acts insistently against the general will, so the government makes a continuous effort against sovereignty. The greater this effort becomes, the more the Constitution changes. As there is here no other corporate will which, by resisting the will of the prince, would balance it sooner or later. The prince must finally oppose the sovereign and break the social treaty. So, in other words, just as private wills act consistently against the general will, so too the government will make effort to this sovereignty. So let's repeat this. I got a big call. Oh my God, I got called. I get interrupted. So therefore, this idea about the change, right? In other words, that it will always act against the government. The government will act against the sovereignty, right? The greater this effort becomes, the more Constitution changes, right? And as here is no other corporate will, again, contra the government, by resisting the will of the prince, would balance it. There's no other corporate will. In other words, there's no other corporate will powerful enough, contrary to the people. If you have a prince who's powerful in a big state, right? And so the prince will oppose the sovereign and break the social contract, the social treaty, right? That is inherent and inevitable with vice, which, from the emergence of the body politic, tends without respite to destroy it, just as old age and death destroys the body. So therefore, like again, the body metaphor. So vice, from the emergence of the body politics, that the vice, it is inherent and inevitable vice, which from the emergence of the body politic, tends without respite, in other words, without dealing with vice, correcting it, stopping it or correcting it, will destroy the body politic, just as old age and death destroys the body. There are two general rules by which a government degenerates, namely when it shrinks or when the state dissolves. So therefore, the government degenerates when it just shrinks in size and there's nothing left of it, or when the state itself, the form that holds it together, dissolves. The government shrinks when it passes from a large to small number. That is from democracy to aristocracy and from aristocracy to royalty. So therefore, in other words, that is the natural tendency because, quote one, the slow formulation and development of the Republic of Venice and its lagoons offered a notable example of the succession. And it is quite amazing that after more than 1,200 years, the Venetians seem to be still only at the second stage, which began with the Sega de Concilio in 1198. As for the ancient dukes who are held against them, whatever the Signature della Libertà may say, It has been proved that they were not the sovereigns. That the dukes, in other words, that explanation said this would say against these this Sara de Singo has not been they are not the sovereign. In the Republic, it will not fail to be cited as the objection from supposedly following a completely opposite development, changing from monarchy to aristocracy, from aristocracy to democracy. I am far from thinking of it in these terms. The original establishment of Romulus was mixed government, which prompted degeneration and despotism. From some particular reasons, the state perished prematurely as a newborn dies before reaching manhood. The expulsions of the Tarquin was the true epoch of the birth of the Republic. But it did not assume a constant form at first because by not abolishing the Principate, only half the work was done. Because the hereditary aristocracy, which is the worst kind of legitimate administration, in in this way remained in conflict with democracy, the form of government, and always uncertain and up in the air, was not settled, as Machiavelli has proved, until the establishment of the tribunes in page 98, note 98. Um, yeah, this is Rousseau apparently has in mind Rome Discourses of Livy, Book 1, chapters 2, 4, and 17. This reference is nonetheless surprising that Machiavelli describes all cycles through which all commonwealths pass as monarchy, tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, anarchy, right? However, Machiavelli explicitly applies this view to Rome, right? This is the line that he talks about. Uh, He goes, so favored was it Rome by fortune that though the transition from monarchy to aristocracy and thence to democracy took place, thus by stages for the very reason laid down early in this discourse, none the less granting the authority of the aristocracy did not abolish altogether the royal state, nor was the authority of the aristocracy wholly removed when the populace was granted a share of it. On the contrary, the blending of these estates made a perfect commonwealth. This is again Book 1, Chapter 2 of the Discourses. Plato's cycle of regimes, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny, Book 8 and 9 of the Republic, right? Again, this is the cycle. This is therefore so Rousseau is kind of quoting Machiavelli, but ignoring Machiavelli's cycle. It's interesting that Machiavelli proved it, but wait a minute. Okay, yeah, was only then there was a real government and true democracy. In fact, the people, when they were not sovereign, but were magistrate and government, and the consuls themselves, albeit patricians, first magistrates, and absolute generals in war, were only presiding officers of the people in Rome. From that time on, the government was seen to follow this natural tendency and lead strongly towards aristocracy. And the Principate abolished itself in a sense, and the aristocracy no longer consisted in the body of patricians as in Venice and Genoa, but in the body of the Senate, composed of patricians and plebeians, and even in the body of the tribute when they began to usurp active power. For words do not change things. And when when the people has leaders who govern for it, whatever name those leaders may assume, they are always an aristocracy. This is an interesting thing, that leaders are always aristocratic. This is kind of an argument pointing to the idea of iron law of oligarchy, that the leaders are always going to have more in common with their leaders than the people that they rule over. That's Robert Michels and his political parties, and the idea of the of oligarchy in terms of Moscow. Right. This is the Italian school. You can see the beginning of the Italian school even here. The abuse of the aristocracy gave rise to the civil wars and the triumvirate. Sulla, Julius Caesar, Augustus became in fact, true monarchs. And finally, under the despotism of Tiberius, the Senate was dissolved. Roman history then does not disprove my principles; it confirms it. Right. This is how he gets that entity in that sense. Now let's return. So that is the natural tendency. If it were to go backwards from a small number to a large one, it could be said to slacken. But this reverse development is impossible. So therefore, we don't go from a royalty to aristocracy to democracy, but rather democracy to aristocracy because of size. Again, this is the Mosque's claim about as the size grows, the structure of government becomes increasingly oligarchic and increasingly oligarchic to the point where it becomes one very big. It becomes royal, right? This idea. Indeed, the government never changes its form except when its worn out mechanism leaves it too weakened to be able to preserve itself. So therefore, it doesn't change its form just because it gets so big, and therefore it becomes too weak to preserve itself. Now it will be. Now, if it were to grow still more slack by further extending itself, its force would become entirely null. Sorry, and it would even and it would be even less likely to survive in that sense, right? If it gets bigger and bigger, 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 right, and it says it falls apart in that sense. The mechanism must therefore be wound up and tightened in proportion as it gives way. Otherwise, the state it supports will fall into ruin. In other words, you have to tighten the mechanism. So if it's too loose, if it's too big, and the structures are too loose, you need to tighten up the instruments of the authority of government. Right? This is why there's that thing about size and power. Right? The size and power. The force leads us to corruption and vices, and then that leads to the losing of power. Right? Otherwise, the state will support. Otherwise, the state it supports, in other words, the mechanisms, right, will fall into ruin. The dissolution of the state can come about in two ways. The first, when the prince no longer administers the state in accordance with the laws and usurps the sovereign power. So therefore, usurps. Then a remarkable change takes place, which is that not the government but the state shrinks. So the government stays powerful, but the state shrink. I mean that the large state dissolves and another is formed within it that is composed slowly of the members of the government, and that it is no longer anything for the rest of the people except its master and tyrant. So that the instant that government usurps sovereignty, the social compact is broken, and all the ordinary citizens, by right recovering their natural freedom, are forced but not obliged to obligated to obey. It's mastery. Coercion is going to. Delusion also occurs when the members of the government separately usurp the power that they ought only to exercise as a body. So therefore, this is a body, but our private actors are doing usurping that for their own action. Right. This is no less infraction of the laws and produce even greater disorder. Then there are, so to speak, as many princes as their magistrates, and the state, no less divided than the government, perishes or changes its form. Right? When the state dissolves, the abuse of government of whatever types takes the name of anarchy. So there was everything. The abuse of government takes anarchy. To distinguish democracy degenerates into holocracy, mob rule, aristocracy into oligarchy. I would add that royalty degenerates into tyranny, but this later term is equivocal and requires explanation. In the ordinary sense, a tyrant is a king who governs with violence and without regards for justice and the laws. In the precise sense, a tyrant is the private individual who assumes the royal authority without having any right to it. The Greeks understood the word tyrant in this manner, and they gave it indistinguishably to good and bad princes whose authorities were not legitimate. This is this idea. Cornelius Nepo, first a quote from this, right? from 100. For all those who exercise power for life in a city that has been accustomed to be free are by are considered to be called tyrants. Cornelius Nepos, Life of Milites. This is chapter 8. In the Lives of Excellent Commanders by edited by John Clock. On the remainder of this note, compare Aristotle's Politics, Book 4, Chapter 10, the Tyranny chapter. And with note, in other words, okay. For an important analysis of Xenophon's hero, see Leo Strauss on Tyranny, and especially page 126, note 7. Increasingly, though, Machiavelli seems to use the word tyrant in a precise way rejected by Rousseau, right? Discourse on trivia. So this is that he rejects it. That, in other words, that this is the tyrant is here. In other words, someone who lacks authority. Again, that a tyrant is in a precise manner that this is an individual who assumed moral authority without having a right to it, and that and Greeks understood the word tyrant as matters that gave it distinguish good or bad princes who were not legitimate in that sense. Thus, tyrant and usurper are two words that are exactly synonymous. So, tyrant and usurper are synonymous in a sense. In order to give different names to different things, I call the usurper of royal authority a tyrant, and the a usurper of sovereign power a despot. So that of in other words, a tyrant is one who engages in royal authority, usurper of royal authority, but the usurper of sovereign power is a despot. That's very interesting. So despot is not a king; he is a despot in a sense, a usurper of the sovereign power. That instead of submitting, the thing about this, usurping the authority of the sovereign is the people, right? The king is nothing merely than the agent of the people. If he usurps the sovereign power, he's a despot. The tyrant is the one who takes over the laws in order to govern according to the laws, right? The tyrant is one who takes over against the laws in order to govern according to the laws. The despot is one who puts himself above the laws themselves. Thus, a tyrant need not be a despot, but a despot is always a tyrant. So this is how he ends the chapter here. We'll stop here. Is that weird ending here? That this is that again, despots. A tyrant need not be a despot, but a despot is always a tyrant. Tyrant does what? It breaks the laws, but usually it's breaking the law to do something. Where despot is puts himself above the laws, and that's the difference in his remark idea here, right? Thus, the tyrant need not be a despot, but a despot is always a tyrant. Okay, that's the logic of his argument. Okay, any comments or questions, please put it here. If I see them, I will respond to them, and I'll get back to you on it. Otherwise, if you like it, hit the like button, share it on social media, share it with your friends. If you've not subscribed, subscribe, get your friends to subscribe. Let's hope to grow the channel some. We've had some people leave, and I almost broke 400 and it went down. I think the machine kind of, people have been not checking for a while. People have been kind of out of it for a while, like a couple of years old, some other early things. So we had some automatic culling by the algorithm. But so, okay, let's hope we grow. If you didn't like it, you can always hit thumbs down and say why in the comments. You can follow me on social media. The links are below. You can follow me in academic social media, the so-called academic social media that deals with my scholarship and my research. Links are below. If you want to contribute and help me to do what I do, please, it'd be nice. Life's expensive. You can do so by by becoming subscribed to our Patreon, or you can do so by buying my books. Again, this is Monday, Wednesdays. I hope to put these out there. For those of you coming to late, maybe years from now, you say, "Oh, what is this? Like, what we already done?" Okay, right now we're doing them live, so this is there. And we'll be doing in the series of this. We'll be doing Smith's dictatorship currently, beginning of dictatorship, and there should be dictatorship videos at the same time. Well, take care. We will look again next time at chapters 11 through 14. Okay? Well, take care. Bye bye. Have a good day.